again, everyone. This week, we do an interview with the amazing Allison about her book Uncharted and probably some other stuff too. Welcome, Allison. How are you today?
Hi, I'm really well. Thanks so much for having me.
Alison, it was really lovely to read your book. Can you tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind writing Uncharted?
Yeah, so Uncharted is a lesbian pirate fantasy, and it actually started a few summers ago. In 2018, I made a joke on Twitter about how The Princess Bride is my favorite movie, and I made a joke about how if the character of Wesley in The Princess Bride had been a woman, it would have been a very different story because a woman would have had an actual plan to rescue Buttercup instead of just sort of sailing around and coming across her. And it was just a joke. It was just meant to be a joke, but then a bunch of people jumped on it and were like, I need to read this book. And I was like, but the book doesn't exist. And they were like, well, you can fix that. And at the time, I had released one male-male romance and sort of thought that was where my career was headed, was contemporary male-male romance. But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, I could write that. Yeah, so it took a long time, a lot of anguish. It's my first fantasy. And it turns out it's a very different art to writing fantasy than it is to contemporary romance. So it took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. But it was published this winter as Uncharted. And yeah, people seem to have responded to it really well.
Could you summarize the book in 3 words?
I think, yeah, lesbian pirate adventure. It turns out that's a whole niche, but that's definitely where this book fits in.
Did you find the readership very different from male-loving men versus lesbian or woman-loving woman?
A lot of my readers had come to me as male-male romance readers. But it turns out, I think there's a fear among male-male authors that their readers won't follow them if they start writing other pairings, and that I don't think has been my experience. I think those readers were really open to new pairings, new genres. A lot of it is trust, right? So with your established readership, if they know you and they like your books, they trust that what you're going to put out, even if it's something a little bit different from what they're used to, is still going to be something they enjoy. So certainly there was fear that they wouldn't necessarily be as embraced by the existing readership, and that hasn't been the case. I've got lots of positive feedback. And then it's been super fun to introduce myself and reach out to the women-loving women and the lesbic readers and try and find a foothold among those readers. There's a review of Uncharted that says something about and it looks like this is this author's first attempt at publishing, and so I really commend her for an enjoyable book. And it's not, but again, I published it under a slightly different pen name, and we can talk about why I did that. But definitely there are always people who haven't heard of you. And I really appreciate anyone who had never heard of me who took a chance on the book just because they like the premise or they like the cover. Yeah, because it's always risky taking sort of a step outside of what's currently working for you. But yeah, so far people have been really lovely and really seem to enjoy Georgina and Cinder's adventures.
You made the jump because of the tweet about The Princess Bride. But why did you choose to write romance, either for men romance or woman-loving woman, rather than the straight world would be probably more, you get a bigger paycheck for it?
I mean, you might get a bigger paycheck. Nothing's ever certain in publishing. When I started writing male-male romance, it was what I was reading. And I had friends who were reading and writing male-male romance, so it was what I was comfortable with. And it's certainly, it's a different niche, but I think ultimately there are different opportunities to explore different kinds of stories. My first book was about a single dad and a teacher who was also a man. And it was interesting. Both of those characters were in roles that are commonly sort of caregiving, quote unquote female roles. And we had two men sort of trying to build lives around those identities. And it was interesting to sort of dive into that. So, I'm not trying to shoehorn people into stories that don't fit for them. So the characters have to work. I have some unpublished male-female romances. And it's not like I could just pull out a woman and pop a man into that story. Like the gender has to work for the story I'm telling. So Uncharted was always going to be female-female, and it would be a very different story if I made it male-female or male-male. Yeah, I mean, it's really about what works for the story, I think.
So you've used a different pen name for your current book, and you used a different name for your books that you published previously. So was that to keep the readership separate?
It's mostly about the Amazon monster. Certainly, I haven't done anything to hide one pen name from the other. All of my male readers know that Alli Temple, this book is a female-female pairing, but it's still me. If you look in the back of the book, I've got all my male titles in there. If you look at my male titles now, it's got Uncharted in the back. So it's not about being sneaky with the readers. It's mostly about Amazon and how Amazon recommends books. So I'm certainly happy if people read Uncharted and go, yes, I'd love to read her contemporary romances. But I didn't want Amazon to get confused about like the also bought banner that comes when you're looking at a book on a listing. So if you enjoyed Uncharted, here are a bunch of other queer fantasy titles that you might also enjoy. If you enjoyed this male contemporary romance, here are a bunch of other contemporary romances you also might enjoy. And I just didn't want to muddy the waters strictly from an algorithm perspective by publishing all of that under one pen name. It's not about being sneaky or thinking that like, well, some people are only going to read these things and some people are only going to read those things. And if they know I'm the same person, then they'll read nothing. Like I want to give people more credit than that. So it's strictly an Amazon algorithm kind of decision.
What bring you first in the writing world?
So my first book was published in March of 2018. And so in February, and it was with an American publisher, and I'm in Canada. So in February of 2018, I went to the bank and I said, I need to open up a US dollar account because I'm going to be paid my royalties in US dollars, and it gets muddy if you put them in a Canadian dollar account. And the young man who helped me was very helpful, very kind, was really excited that I had published a book. I told him it was a gay romance. He told me his sister was gay, and then he wanted my pen name, and he wanted a link to the book so he could buy it for her. He was really charming. And then he said, how long have you been a writer? And I said, well, I think I've always been a writer. I think most people who are writers, you know, we've all got like notebooks from middle school of like really bad poetry or novels that never got finished, or we tried NaNoWriMo a half dozen times and never quite got there. And he goes, no, sorry. I need to put a date in my file for your employment history. And I sort of went, oh, well, you can say January, that's fine. But I do think that's true. I think people who are writers, like there's always been some indication that they have been a writer for a very long time. And whether that's short stories in grade school or really bad poetry, like there's always sort of that trail of half-finished projects before they finally went like, okay, I think this is something other people could read.
How much research did you have to do for Uncharted, and what was the hardest part?
Like I spent a lot of time Googling random things as I was writing, like what's the name of this deck on the ship. I spent a lot of time researching clothes. I have a cousin who's a costume designer. She spent a lot of time letting me ask her just questions over and over because I really wanted the clothing in the story to represent sort of the journey that Georgina goes on. And so, you know, what they wear in Redmere outwardly, I mean, it really reflects the country. Like outwardly, it's very elaborate, very almost fashionable, but inside it's very heavy, very restrictive. Just like the country, I think on the outside could look, you know, fairly grand with, you know, a big city and tall towers, but on the inside is actually slowly sort of crushing its people. And then once I got beyond that, once Georgina gets out of Redmere and into the greater world, then you have sort of this wider array of clothing. Some of it's functional, some of it's decorative. It's often not as restrictive, and she has to sort of come to grips with where her comfort level is in terms of who she wants to be beyond the walls of Redmere and in the clothes she wears and her physical appearance. So I spent a lot of time trying to find the right way to describe the clothing and the feeling in my head. Yeah, I grew up in a sailing family. We had a boat when I was a kid, and we spent a lot of time. We used to go to like maritime history museums and things like that. So a lot of the like the high seas, tall ship stuff was like random knowledge that had been squashed in my brain as a kid that sort of unearthed itself in the process of writing this book. But the clothing, I think, was the thing I spent the most time on in terms of trying to find the details I wanted.
So without giving too many spoilers away, there's a really interesting like fight scene where the pirate ship is chased by the
Mm-hmm.
prince. How hard was it to write that scene?
No, see that again, that's that weird maritime history, like yeah, I mean I know how to sail a boat. I know, and obviously sailing a boat on Lake Ontario is very different than sailing a tall ship on an ocean. But I know the basic premise of how to get a boat to go and who is going to go faster when you're sailing in which direction. And then a lot of it was movies, you know, and not that I'm sort of pulling directly from a movie, but that sense of tension of like getting closer and closer, but still being fairly far away. I did it actually right after I released Uncharted. Like I rewatched all of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, which are hilarious and terrible, but actually have a lot of really good sea battle scenes in them. And Master and Commander with Russell Crowe is another great sort of historical maritime type story. Yeah, so a lot of that was just pulling from things I had seen, stuff I had learned. Yeah, but that I really enjoyed writing that scene, because what's a good pirate story if you don't have some kind of sea chase or
Yep.
battle? Or
Was there a character voice that come easy for you than other? Which character was that?
So Prince Beverly was the first time, because all of my other stuff before Uncharted came out had been contemporary romance. Prince Beverly was the first time that I wrote like an actual villain. You know, there's conflict in romance, but I'd never written a true bad guy. And it was a bit alarming how easy it was to make him evil. So he came pretty quickly, and that sort of almost kind, but mostly slippery kind of evil was pretty loud. I think Ender is probably the closest character to like a true parallel to the Princess Bride. There's a lot of Fezzik in him, just that sort of like gentle giant sort of feeling. And he obviously, it's not the same character, but that voice I think is fairly similar. Yeah, those were the two that came the easiest. George and Cinder fought me for a long time. Cinder especially was very angry at a lot of people, including me. And it took a long time to sort of nail down her voice and her motivation.
And do you have an idea why it was so hard to get Cinder's voice?
Part of it because I wasn't writing from Cinder's point of view, so I didn't have a lot of opportunities to fill in, you know, that internal dialogue that helps develop a character as you're writing them. But I think Cinder does have a lot of anger and a lot of fear. She doesn't let people in easily, and that includes the writer. Like she's not going to spill her heart to you and or to me and say like these are the things I'm feeling and this is why. The original first draft of Uncharted was very different from the book that she read, and it was basically like 95,000 words of them sailing in a circle while Cinder just sort of was terrible to George. Not like physically, but just told her what she thought of her over and over and over. It wasn't a very good book. But that was all Cinder wanted to be in the first round, was just this sort of like aloof, removed, I'm a pirate, I'm a bad person, you don't know me, over and over and over. So it took a long time to chip away at that and find who the person was underneath it.
Are you a visual writer? Do you visualize your scenes before you put them on paper?
I hear them, I think, more than visualize them. Like I don't have a map of what the world looks like or anything like that. I do tend to make sort of Pinterest boards when I'm getting started, just to have an idea of what characters might look like, or if there's particular elements, little things that I want to put in a story. I'm finishing a new romance right now that takes place at a fishing lodge in Alaska, so I've got a whole Pinterest board of like what the boat looks like, what the hotel looks like, so that sort of thing. But dialogue is always the thing that comes easiest to me when I'm writing, and so I tend to hear the story and hear what the characters are saying to each other more than I like see the setting. I often get complaints from my editor that I don't describe visually a lot what people are seeing. because that's just not how the story comes to me. So that's something that gets layered in after the fact.
Do you plan to write and publish other books for queer-centric, woman-centric novel?
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, certainly I hope to write more stories. I don't think Georgina and Cinder's story is done. I think there's definitely more adventures for them. And then, yeah, I mean, again, it's really about the pairings that work for the story I want to tell. And if you talk to anybody who knows me, like I have this teeny tiny little attention span. So anything I say here in this interview about like, yeah, I'm currently working on, so I have planned for next year. I think it'll be a female vampire story. But like, don't hold me to that until it's like actually published, because that might change. I have like an urban fantasy series that I've got the first book written. It's male female, but the second one is definitely a female pairing. I haven't written it yet, but like the first book, that's definitely where that story is going. Like the next two main characters in that series are both women. So yeah, I mean, I love male romance, and I love my male romance readers. But as I start exploring new genres and new stories, I want to be true to the characters who are leading those stories, regardless of their gender.
Will we ever get to see Cinder's backstory or how Cinder and Maro met? Because that pairing was really interesting as well.
Yeah, yeah. So the second book in this series, which I'm working on now, is told from Cinder's point of view. So we will get more of her backstory. We might get more of how she and Maro became a pair. That dynamic is really interesting. It is interesting to write a sequel. I've never written a true sequel to a story before. It's interesting to like see when you change the point of view, so that now this is Cinder's story, like who becomes more prominent in the story. So obviously Maro is there a lot more than they were in Uncharted, because George didn't really know Maro. But then characters like Rosie, who was George's confidant, are there, but they don't necessarily play the same role. So it's interesting to sort of find the balance between the characters that fit well with the story and the characters that the reader is already familiar with, and will want to see, because that's how they'll get pulled into the stories. I don't want Cinder to be a mystery forever and ever.
So Marlowe is, I think, what we could categorize as an NB person. I'm not familiar with your other work. Was this a new thing for you, or are you usually working with outside of the binary?
Yeah, no, Maro definitely was like the first major non-binary character. Then there have been a they, them in someone's office somewhere, but as a major character, Maro was definitely the first. I want to give credit to my editor, who really, like, I worked very hard in the draft that I sent to them, to have I wanted the pirate ship to be very ethnically diverse, that it had pulled a lot of people from a lot of different places, as pirate ships tended to do. And it was my editor who went, have you thought about increasing the gender diversity or lack of gender diversity on the ship as well? And they land in Belder's Landing, which, they spent a lot of time at a brothel, and that was sort of George's first experience in sort of somewhere that was sexually freer than where she had come from. And to have someone who was also non-binary is just another way to show how much wider the world is once George gets out of Redmere. People have really enjoyed reading Maro, and lots of people go, but what about Maro's story? And like, I think with infinite time and resources, like there are so many stories in this world to tell, and like Maro could get a whole prequel backstory, and I think Davina and the people who work for her at the Captain's Peg, I have like a whole bunch of like murder mysteries that they're gonna solve. Like I think there's so many stories to tell in this world, but Maro definitely is one character who has stood out to readers, and I think in part because they are non-binary, and in part I think because it's not a major plot point. They use they, them, and everyone sort of goes, okay, they're more than their pronouns.
Did you actually plot everything before you started writing the book, or did you know what pairing was going to happen before you started writing the book?
I knew that George and Cinder, it's George and Cinder's story. I was really surprised. Someone said, like, I really thought this was going to be George and Rosie's story, and that never occurred to me. I love writing stories where women have women friends, because I wrote, and I'm guilty of this. As a teenager, I wrote a lot of like not like other girls stories, and I think that's something you wind up doing in your teen years, is you're sort of learning your own identity and where you fit in the world. But it was really important to me that George had a female confidant, who was going to go on this adventure with her. Yeah, and that pairing in my head was never going to be romantic. It didn't necessarily realize that Rosie and Ender were going to be a thing. But yeah, from the minute I started writing that book, it was always going to be George and Cinder. It just took them a very long time to get there.
What is the hardest part of writing a book for you?
All of it.
So why do it?
Because I can't not. I can't not write. Getting through the middle part of the narrative is always the hardest part. Like once you've gotten through the initial crisis, in this case of George, we're sending you to the palace, you're going to marry the prince, like that. I think I wrote that opening act. And in fact, the opening act that you read is pretty close to the original one I wrote. That took me, I want to say like a week and a half. And then it took me a year to write the rest of it. And then the ending is always, particularly, this ending was a little bit harder, but the ending, roughly where you want to be by the end of the story. It's the middle bit where you have to get all of the pieces in order. There were so many. This is the problem. So I'm what they call a pantser, in that I don't plot my books in advance. I like to tell people I do sometimes because it makes it sound like I know what I'm doing, but I don't. So them getting through that mushy middle, and then in this case, revising and revising and revising until all the bits in the middle fit. I think that's definitely the hardest part.
In terms of writing and publishing, if you could go back in time, what advice would you give your younger self?
I think, the advice you hear from published authors to unpublished authors is often like, take your time, enjoy being unpublished, because once you're published, the treadmill starts. The best way to sell the book that you just published is to publish another one. And so once that first book is out there, people are going to go like, are you writing something else? When's it coming? And particularly now with the proliferation of self-publishing, which obviously I'm a staunch supporter of, like the timelines just get so much faster. Like a book like Uncharted, if you went with a traditional publisher, you'd probably put out sequels like every 18 months to 2 years. Like that's the cycle of traditional publishing. Self-publishing, like I'm already behind in terms of getting the second book out, and I'm not even done writing it. So on the one hand, like I would tell my past self, like once the books are out there, you're just going to have to keep going. So like, be ready for that. On the other hand, like at some point you just have to do it. I know so many writer friends who are unpublished and who are terrified to pull the trigger. And so they just keep rewriting and revising the same story. They've been working on the same story for the last 8 years. And sometimes that's necessary. But like the thing about publishing is the book will never be perfect. And you'll never write a book that everybody likes. It's impossible. And so at some point you have to learn to say like, yep, this is good enough, and put it out there. Like I could tell you the things that I wish were slightly different about Uncharted. I'm not going to, but there are still things that I still go like, I don't know if that's the way I wanted that to go. But like, too late, the book is out. There's an audiobook of it. Someone has recorded it. Like it's extra done in stone. But at some point you just have to be okay with that and move on to the next one. Otherwise you'll never get anything out. So I think to my past self, like you have to find that balance of being prepared to get things out as quickly as possible, but also understanding that no book is ever going to be perfect, and you do just have to eventually start publishing.
What is your creative process?
I'm not actually a very creative person, and I know that sounds weird given that Uncharted is my 8th book. I published one more since then, and I have another one coming out in July. I'm a very methodical person, so So I love the method of creating, if that makes sense. I love the fact that these stories that didn't exist before came out of my brain, and now they're out in the world and we can talk about them. Like when I release a book, when I start sending it out to beta readers, the first person who comes back to me and says, I love Cinder, she was an amazing character. Like, it's so weird to me that something that has lived in my brain is now out there and other people know about it and can talk about it. But as a writer, I had a friend who described me once as I'm a grinder. Like, I don't need to light a candle. I don't need the sun to be at a particular angle. I don't need to be in a particular space. I've written books on trains, in my back porch, in coffee shops, waiting for my car to get an oil change. Like, as long as I have a laptop, I will keep writing. And so, my creativity is finding ways to tell stories, even when the conditions aren't quite ideal.
One of the things that really struck me when I first looked at Uncharted was the cover. The cover design is so beautiful. How did you go about choosing the cover?
So I have an amazing cover designer named Kate Ashwood. She's based in British Columbia, Canada. She's done all my covers except for my first one that came through a publisher. And for Uncharted, I sent her this really bad, really long, rambly email that was like, I wrote a pirate book. It's all ladies. I need it to feel like really adventurous and kind of dark. I think I did send her like one or two other covers that I had seen online, and like, it sort of needs to feel like this, but also here are the 12 things that I don't like about this cover, which is why I'm coming to you instead. And the cover that she sent me is the first draft that she made. The only thing that's different between the cover that is on the book now and the first one that Kate sent me is the crown on the model's head. Everything else she sent it to me, I cried because it was so perfect. Even with my mail covers, like, she has this vision and this aesthetic, and all of my emails are the same. They're always like, okay, here's the setting, here's the guy. I sort of like this model, but he's holding a guitar and there's no guitar in my book. Like, what can you do? And she always sends back amazing things. So every time I send her something, that's often what gets me to the end of the draft, is I'll have like a little post-it note reminding myself that I'm not allowed to email Kate until the draft is done. And I finished a lot of books just so that I can see what cover she comes up with when it's ready.
You said earlier that you can write anywhere as long as you have a laptop. Does this applies to if you got like a napkin and a pen, or you actually need digital?
No, I'm pretty much a digital writer. There's a wonderful creative writing company in Toronto called Firefly Creative Writing. And in the pre-COVID times, I used to go on sort of weekend retreats with them. And that's the sort of environment where I'd fill up a notebook with notes and stories and stuff like that. But as far as novel writing goes, every so often, if I get an idea in the middle of something and I don't have my laptop with me, I might like make a note to myself in my phone. But I don't even like using Google Docs. Actually, Uncharted was the only novel I have ever drafted in Word. All of my other drafts, I always write in Scrivener. And when you talk to authors, there's this huge debate over like Scrivener versus Word versus whatever. And drafting in Word was a nightmare. Like, when you get to a story that big with that many scenes, it's just way too unwieldy. So really, when I say I need a laptop, what I really mean is I need Scrivener, because that's how I keep everything organized.
Uncharted has recently come out as an audiobook narrated by Emily Zeller. How did you end up choosing Emily as the narrator?
She found me, actually. It's my first audiobook. I really felt that a story like this, a big story like this, needed an audio version. I'm a long time, almost all of my reading is an audiobook. I don't actually read books with my eyes very often. But I posted an audition. I think it's the scene where we meet Cinder for the first time on the ship. And I posted it for auditions on a couple different websites for audiobook narrators, and Emily was one of the people who responded, and her audition was amazing. She's got a very impressive back catalog. I felt a little overwhelmed that she was interested in recording my book when, my catalog is not nearly as impressive as hers. But she was amazing to work with. I think she's done an absolutely stellar job, and she was great to work with from the beginning.
Except for writing and reading, could you share with your viewers some of your hobby?
I mean, in pandemic times, it's hard to have hobbies. My husband and I got a rescue dog last summer. He was a 6-month-old puppy from Mexico, and that has basically become my personality. Is I'm just a full-time dog mom. We walk all the time, spend a lot of time outside. When I speak to friends and family, the conversation sort of goes like, "How you been? How's the dog? Let's talk about COVID." Like that's sort of those are the 3 things I can talk about. We have a dog and a cat, and the pets take up a lot of my brain space these days. In the before COVID times, and hopefully in the future, my husband and I really love to travel. We took an amazing trip to Mexico City a couple of years ago. I would love to go back. I'm an introvert by nature, so pandemic living hasn't been as challenging for me as it might be for other people. I don't miss people the way my husband does. He works in customer service, like he loves talking to people, and I don't miss it to the degree he does, but I do miss building new experiences. And so whether that's going on a vacation, seeing people, eating in a restaurant, like all of those things are things that I used to like to do that I haven't done in a long time, and I'm really looking forward to doing again, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Do you read your book reviews? And if so, how do you deal with the maybe not so great reviews?
I try not to. I used to read them more than I do now. As far as negative reviews go, like everyone's entitled to their opinion. When I first moved to Toronto in my 20s, I was in a book club with a bunch of other women about my age, and I was the friend who never liked anything we read. And I don't think of myself as an overly critical person, but my reading tastes are very specific, and so I'm not going to like every book that's out there, and I don't expect everyone to like every book that I write. Enjoying a book that you're reading is so dependent on the mood you're in. I've had reviews that were like, "This book was fine. I didn't really enjoy it, but I'm pretty sure that's me. I just was in a pissy mood today." Like so much of whether or not you enjoy a book has to do with where you're at in the moment. All I can do is put out the best book that I can, work with the best editors that I can so that I know the quality of the book is there. Reviewing is super subjective, and as long as you're not putting out something that's full of mechanical errors or is super racially or insensitive to marginalizations in any way, I think those are my responsibilities as an author. But if you're telling a story sensitively and honestly, whether or not people like it is really up to them. It doesn't mean that I've done something wrong.
Are you a full-time writer, or do you have another job?
I'm a full-time writer. I'm not necessarily a full-time author. So I do a lot of freelance writing. I work for a marketing agency that has clients all over the place. I've produced podcasts in the past. If you need words written, I can probably do it for you. So I make my living as a writer, but the book part of it only works out to maybe 50% of my time and revenue.
Do you think you'll ever write another book in a fantasy world? Did you enjoy writing a book based in a fantasy world?
I hope so. Yeah. No, I mean, I have, again, I've got that tiny attention span, but a lot of my plot bunnies are fantasy in some niche, whether it's, Uncharted is more of like a historical fantasy. There's some urban fantasy that's floating around in my head. There's fae, there's angels. I've got my goal before I die book is this like Firefly meets Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, like space western, and like, so yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of stories in me that aren't that don't have a contemporary setting. I like my contemporary stories too. Certainly with COVID, writing contemporary stories has been challenging. Like I wrote the book I'm working on publishing for July right now. There's a couple scenes in restaurants. I'm like, who goes to restaurants anymore? So it's, and the longer we do live in this pandemic world, the harder it is to sort of know what parts you're supposed to change in your contemporary settings. So with something like a fantasy setting, I get to make the rules, and they don't have pandemics there. If they want to go to a busy marketplace and bump shoulders with people, like that's totally fine. So lots of stories in other worlds, I hope, coming in the future.
Could we just talk a little bit about yourself as an author? Do you get time to read? And if so, what books do you enjoy reading?
So, like I said, I have been an audiobook listener for a long, long time, more than 10 years. And originally I was doing that because my day job involved a lot of driving. And so audiobooks are a great way to consume books if you don't have your hands and your eyes free. And then when I started writing, it turned out that if I was reading a book with my eyes, I would start to integrate the voice of the book into the thing I was writing. Not in a plagiarism kind of way, but just in terms of like the speech patterns and the tone. And like, I don't want to do that. This isn't their story. This is my story. So, but somehow when I'm listening to audiobooks, that overlap doesn't happen. So, but because of that, audiobooks take longer to get through than often reading books with your eyes. I wish there was a better way to describe reading versus audiobooks. But anyway, so I'm a very slow audiobook listener. I'm currently finishing Winter's Orbit, which is a queer sci-fi, lots of non-binary rep in the supporting cast in that book. I think I really enjoyed that. A lot of my reading lately has been science fiction or fantasy. I think, again, because it's just a little bit weird to be reading contemporary titles, and it's like watching TV and seeing people too close together, and you sort of have that eye twitch of like, step away. But I've got like 45 minutes left on Winter's Orbit. And so that's the only thing in my brain right now is like, I want to know how this all wraps up.
So we're here in the This or That part of our show. Are you ready, Alli?
Let's do it.
Music or silence?
Music.
Cocktail or mocktail?
Cocktail.
Day or night?
Day.
Friends, family, lovers?
Family.
Club, bar, restaurant?
Restaurant.
Theater, cinema?
Cinema.
Early bird, night owl?
Oh, night owl.
Socks or blankets?
Blankets.
Vanilla or chocolate?
Chocolate.
Spice or mild?
Mild.
Montreal Canadian? Maple Leaf of Toronto?
Maple Leaf.
That was an easy
That
one.
was cheeky.
I should have been me, like Montreal Canadian or Boston Bruins. My wife is always, the Bruins gonna win. The Bruins gonna win. And I'm like,
The Leafs have lost a lot of series to the Bruins. So,
yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Alison. It was great to have you and to chat to you. Do you have any parting words for your readers?
Thank you so much for watching this, for reading my book. Uncharted was a step outside what I'm used to, and you took a chance on that, and I'm so appreciative of that.